The chairs were white and the aisle was lined with peonies, and I was fixing a loose pin in my veil for the third time, when my best friend Hannah leaned in and whispered that my mother's seat, front row, left side, was still empty. It was 6 minutes before the processional. I checked my phone once, calmly, the way I check anything. A single text from my mother, sent 11 minutes earlier. Can't make it today. Family emergency. I'm so sorry. Talk soon. No call. No explanation beyond that one line. Just 4 words doing the work of an entire relationship quietly ending. I didn't cry. I didn't ask Hannah to call her again. I handed my phone to my maid of honor, told her to keep it face down in her clutch for the rest of the night, and I walked down that aisle on my father's oldest friend's arm, with a smile that nobody in that room, not even the man I was marrying, could tell was costing me anything at all. My name is Claire Whitman. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last 11 years working as a trusts and estates attorney, which means I spend my days reading the fine print of exactly how people distribute love, money, and obligation, once they're no longer around to explain themselves. I read wills the way other people read novels, for what's said, and just as carefully for what's been deliberately left out. My job has taught me that the documents people sign under pressure rarely look like documents signed under pressure. They look calm, reasonable, notarized. You have to already know what coercion looks like on paper to see it hiding inside something that appears, on its surface, entirely voluntary. I believed, right up until my wedding day, that whatever was happening with my mother was a choice. A cold one, maybe an unforgivable one, but a choice, made by a grown woman with her own free will. I did not yet understand how wrong that belief was going to turn out to be. I've built my career on a specific kind of quiet suspicion. When a client's elderly father suddenly changes his will 3 months after a new caretaker moves in, or when a wealthy widow's daughter-in-law starts attending every single meeting and answering every single question before the widow can open her mouth, I know exactly what I'm looking at, and I know exactly how patiently it has to be proven. I have sat across from 100 families untangling exactly this kind of quiet erosion of a person's own will. I simply never imagined I would eventually need those same instincts inside my own family, aimed at my own mother. My parents divorced when I was 19, quietly, and without much drama, the kind of ending that comes after years of 2 people simply running out of whatever it was that used to hold them together. My father passed away 6 years later, and for a long stretch after that, it was just my mother and me, closer than we'd ever been, 2 women rebuilding a smaller version of a family, out of what was left. Then, 5 years ago, she met Richard Voss, at a community fundraiser, and within 8 months, they were married in a courthouse ceremony I wasn't even told about, until after it happened. Richard came with a ready-made family of his own, 2 adult children, Mara and Colton, from his first marriage, and my mother, who had spent years feeling like she'd failed at building a lasting family the first time, threw herself into building this one, with an intensity that startled me. She paid for Mara's wedding 2 years ago, down to the flowers. She babysat Colton's kids every weekend. She started referring to Richard's children as the kids, the same soft phrase she'd always reserved for me, and something in me, something I wasn't proud of, curdled every time I heard it. I told myself I was happy for her. I told myself a lot of things, that year and the ones after it, that I didn't fully believe. Looking back, I can pick out the small moments I dismissed at the time. My mother stopped mentioning her own plans in our calls, and started mentioning Richard's instead. What Richard thought about her retiring early. What Richard thought about selling the house. What Richard thought she should do with money my father had left her, years before Richard ever existed. She'd always been a decisive woman, the kind who picked a paint color in 5 minutes and never looked back, and somewhere along the way she started prefacing every opinion with, "Well, Richard thinks," as though her own judgment needed his before it counted. I noticed it, and let it go, the way you let go of 100 small oddities in someone you love, telling yourself none of them mean anything on their own. Mara, in particular, was warm to me, in a way that made me want to trust her, and made me strangely uneasy at the same time. Both at once, the way you can feel 2 contradictory things about the same person, and not know which one is true. She'd hug me a little too long at family dinners, compliment my career a little too pointedly, ask my mother questions about her finances in a tone dressed up as concern. Admiration and envy wear the same face when you're the one standing close enough to see it up close. And for a long time I told myself I was imagining the second one entirely. Over those 5 years, my mother slowly became harder to reach. Phone calls that used to happen every Sunday shrank down to once a month, then less. She stopped coming to things, not just my wedding, but smaller things first, birthdays, a work event I'd invited her to, a weekend trip we'd planned a year in advance, and cancelled 2 days beforehand, for reasons that were always vague, and always, somehow, urgent. Richard was almost always in the room during our calls by the end, and I noticed, without letting myself fully register it, that her answers started sounding like his answers, phrased the way he phrased things, using words she didn't usually use. That night, after the reception ended and I'd changed out of a wedding dress my mother had never seen me wear, I sat on the hotel bed and made a decision so quiet that my new husband, asleep beside me, never noticed I'd made it. I wasn't going to call her crying. I wasn't going to send an angry text she could talk her way around later with that same practiced calm Richard always seemed to be standing just behind. I was going to find out, carefully and completely, what family emergency actually meant, before anyone knew I was looking. That's the rule I've built my entire career around. The one I recite to clients half my mother's age who are trying to figure out whether a parent's new will was written freely, or written under someone's thumb. Gather everything before they know you've seen it. The moment a person realizes they're being examined, their story gets rehearsed, and their paperwork gets cleaner. I wasn't interested yet in what anyone was going to tell me. I wanted whatever was true, before anyone had time to arrange it into something more comfortable. 2 days later, before I'd even started looking, a lawyer called me. Not my mother's usual attorney, a mild, familiar man named Preston who'd handled her modest affairs for a decade. This was someone new, a woman named Adele Marsh, calling from a small estate planning practice 2 counties over, asking, with careful professional distance, whether I would be willing to meet regarding a matter concerning your mother's estate plan. She wouldn't say more on the phone. She asked me to come alone. I spent the 2 days before that meeting doing what I do for a living. My mother, years earlier, back when things were simpler between us, had given me limited digital access to help her manage bill payments after my father died, an old habit neither of us had ever bothered to formally revoke. I used it carefully, methodically, the way I'd walk a client through a decade of financial statements looking for the one number that didn't belong. What I found didn't look like a woman choosing a new family over her old one. It looked like a woman being slowly, systematically cut off from everyone who might have helped her notice. 3 refinancing documents on the house she'd owned outright since before Richard, all signed within the last year, all funneling equity into an account held jointly with Richard, and, oddly, with Colton listed as a secondary signer. A new durable power of attorney, filed 8 months earlier, replacing the one that had named me, replacing it with Richard. Notary stamps from a mobile notary service Richard had used 3 separate times, always at the house, never at an office, which is precisely the pattern I've spent a decade training junior associates to flag as a red flag in elder financial cases, though my mother is only 61, and I had never once let myself apply that word to her. I built a timeline the way I would for any client, dates down one column, dollar amounts down another, because that's how the fog clears for me when nothing else will. I cross-referenced the notary visits against my mother's calendar, which she still shared with me from years earlier, back when sharing it had meant nothing more than helping coordinate a dentist appointment. Every single notary visit landed on a day Richard's calendar showed him traveling for work, which meant, on paper, he was 2 states away each time his wife signed something significant. A detail designed, I suspected, to make the arrangement look less orchestrated than it clearly was. I found a folder of scanned bank statements going back 3 years, and watched a savings account that had once held a comfortable, steady sum shrink in uneven bursts, always in round numbers, always followed within days by a payment towards something in Colton's name, a truck, a down payment, a business he'd started and quietly closed within a year. People who believe they'll never get caught leave the messiest trails, because certainty makes a person careless, and Richard had never imagined that the daughter he'd spent years politely, patiently pushing to the margins, was also a woman who reads exactly this kind of paperwork for a living. The dates told their own quiet story once I laid them side by side. Every major transfer had happened within a week of some event that would have pulled outside attention toward my mother. A birthday, a holiday, and now, apparently, my wedding. I sat with that pattern for a long time before I let myself see what it actually was. This wasn't simply a woman choosing Richard's family over mine. Something else was happening underneath it. Something that made the missed wedding look less like betrayal, and more like a symptom of something much larger. Adele Marsh confirmed the rest of it when I finally sat across from her 2 days later. My mother, it turned out, had come to her alone 4 months earlier, without Richard's knowledge, frightened and unsure of herself, in a way Adele said she'd rarely seen in a client, asking quietly how she might undo some of what she'd signed. She told Adele that Richard had begun handling all her mail, all her appointments, all her calls, gently at first, then completely, always framed as care, as love, as a husband simply taking burdens off his wife's shoulders. She told Adele she'd wanted to come to my wedding more than almost anything, that she'd bought a dress for it 3 weeks in advance, and that the morning of, Richard had told her Colton's youngest was in the hospital, that they needed to leave immediately, that there wasn't time to explain further, and by the time she'd realized the emergency had resolved itself within an hour, with barely a phone call needed, the wedding was already over, and there was no way left to fix it without an explanation she wasn't yet brave enough to give. She had been trying, in her own frightened, quiet way, to build a case of her own, before anyone knew she'd started looking. She just hadn't told me that the daughter she'd have trusted most to help her, was doing the exact same thing, 3 counties away, without either of us knowing the other had started. It came out in full the following week, not from Richard, and not from my mother either, but from Colton, of all people, at a family dinner I wasn't at but heard about the next morning from Mara, who called me sounding shaken in a way I'd never once heard from her before. She said Colton had been drinking more than usual, and somewhere between dinner and dessert he'd simply broken, saying he couldn't keep pretending he didn't know what his father had been doing. watching my mother slowly disappear a little more every year, while everyone at that table benefited quietly from her disappearing. Mara said the table went completely silent. The specific silence that has weight to it, that presses down on everyone's shoulders at once. She said Richard's face didn't move at first, didn't change at all, and that was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. She said my mother sat very still with her hands folded in her lap, staring at a spot on the tablecloth, and that when she finally looked up, it wasn't at Richard, it was at Colton, like she was silently thanking him for saying out loud the things she hadn't been able to say for years. Mara said nobody at that table moved to defend Richard, not even her. Mara said the worst part wasn't the silence itself, it was what happened after it broke. Richard tried, twice, to laugh it off, to call Colton dramatic, to reach for my mother's hand the way he always did when a room needed calming down, and for the first time in 5 years, Mara said, my mother pulled her hand back before he could take it. Just that small motion, quiet and unremarkable to anyone who hadn't spent years watching her stop making choices of her own. Mara said she watched her father's face when that happened, and it was the first time she'd ever seen him look genuinely afraid of losing something. I confirmed the last of it through Adele, and, separately, through a forensic review I requested from a colleague who specializes in undue influence cases. A careful, credentialed second opinion, I insisted on, precisely because I didn't want my own anger toward Richard, shading what I believed had happened to my mother. The pattern was unmistakable and sadly, a familiar one in my field. Isolation dressed as devotion. Small transfers that grew larger once no one was checking. A vulnerable spouse convinced, gently and repeatedly, that keeping the peace mattered more than keeping her own name on her own accounts. So there had been no betrayal in the way I'd spent 2 furious, quiet days assuming. My mother hadn't chosen Richard's family over mine at all. She had been carefully, deliberately maneuvered into a corner, where choosing anything for herself had started to feel impossible. Richard came to my mother's lawyer's office the week after that, at my insistence, because I wanted this conversation to happen somewhere he didn't control the walls around it. He looked smaller than I remembered him looking, smaller than the confident, easy man who'd once shaken my hand at his own wedding like he was doing me a favor by marrying into my family. I was protecting her, he said, his voice low, careful. She's not good with money, she never has been. I was just handling things so she wouldn't have to worry. You didn't protect her, I told him, and I kept my voice level, the same voice I use across a conference table, when I'm about to walk a room full of confident people, through exactly where their story stops matching their paperwork. You decided, without ever asking her, that she wasn't capable of choosing anything for herself. That isn't protection, Richard. That's control, dressed up as devotion, so it doesn't have to look like what it actually is. He asked for a chance to fix it, told me he loved her, told me none of it had started out the way it had ended up. And here is the line I'd been quietly assembling since that lawyer first called me, the one I'd carried into that room like a closing argument I'd rehearsed 100 times without meaning to. I told him I could understand, in some clinical, distant way, how a person convinces himself that control is care, if he tells himself that story long enough. But understanding how someone talked themselves into 3 years of quiet manipulation doesn't obligate anyone to forgive it, and it certainly doesn't obligate my mother to keep living inside it. Understanding why isn't the same thing as forgiving, and forgiving was never going to be the same thing as her staying. We didn't turn it into a spectacle. I've spent my career watching what bitterness does to an estate, how it drags a family through years of proceedings and leaves everyone poorer and angrier than when they started. And I wasn't going to let that happen to my mother, in the one chapter of her life where she most needed things to move quickly and cleanly. Adele and I worked together to unwind what could be unwound, restore what could be restored, and document everything else for the divorce that followed within the year. My mother didn't fight for vindication. She fought, quietly and for the first time in years, simply to have her own name back on her own accounts. When Richard asked her, near the end of it, whether there was any version of this where she reconsidered, she told him no, gently but completely. The way you close the cover on a book once you already know exactly how it ends. There was nothing left to discover by opening it again. The divorce itself took 8 months, longer than either of us wanted, because untangling 5 years of jointly held property, from someone determined to make every step as slow as possible, is rarely fast, no matter how clean the underlying facts are. My mother sat through every deposition without raising her voice once, and I sat beside her at the ones I was allowed to attend, not as her attorney, since I couldn't be, but as her daughter, watching a woman I'd once assumed had simply stopped choosing me slowly remember how to choose herself instead. It's been a little over a year now. My mother lives 40 minutes from me, in a small house she bought entirely on her own, and she comes to Sunday dinner nearly every week, the way she used to before Richard, before the slow years of disappearing I didn't fully understand, until it was almost too late to reverse. I still practice estate law, but I've started taking on more of these cases than I ever expected to, quietly specializing in exactly the kind of undue influence that nearly cost my mother everything, because I finally understand, in a way no law school ever taught me, how ordinary, and how well disguised that kind of control can look from the outside. Some of my clients find outright theft when we dig in. Some find a will that no longer says what the person actually wanted. Some, like my mother, find something harder to name, and harder to prove. And all of them leave my office, finally able to read their own life, instead of trusting someone else to summarize it for them. My mother came to my 1-year anniversary dinner this spring, sat in the front row seat that had been empty at my wedding, and gave a toast that started with an apology I told her, more than once, she didn't owe me anymore. She gave it anyway. She said the hardest part hadn't been leaving Richard. It had been admitting to herself, and to me, that she'd let someone else do her thinking for her for 5 quiet years without ever noticing it happening in real time. I told her that's exactly why I do this work now, because it never announces itself as anything as simple as choosing a new family over an old one. It just quietly takes a person's voice away from them, one small signature at a time, until somebody finally reads the fine print out loud. Sometimes the greatest justice isn't punishing the person who did it. It's simply handing someone their own name back, and teaching them how to read the fine print of their own life again. I still think about that empty chair sometimes, front row, left side, and the 4-word text that arrived 11 minutes before I walked down the aisle. Not because it hurt, though it did, for longer than I let anyone see, but because it was the moment I finally started reading my own family the way I'd always read everyone else's contracts, closely, patiently, and without assuming the calm surface told the whole story underneath it. So tell me, if you'd gotten that text 11 minutes before your own wedding, would you have gone looking for the truth the way I did? Or would you have let the anger simply sit there, unexamined? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and tell me honestly whether you think Claire moved too fast, or not fast enough. And if this story pulled you in, make sure you're subscribed, because there are a lot more women like Claire whose stories still deserve to be told.